He thought he could control the truth, until the truth walked into the room. The courtroom felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that didn't come from the air conditioning, but from the silence that settled over polished wood benches and fluorescent lights humming overhead, a silence that carried weight, judgment, and something unspoken that no one dared to name. And at the center of it all stood Officer Daniel Brooks, shoulders squared, uniform crisp, voice steady as he addressed the court with the kind of confidence that only comes from someone who has never been questioned long enough to doubt himself. His words flowing smoothly, carefully constructed, shaping a version of events that felt clean, believable, and dangerously final. And just a few feet away sat Ava Carter, hands resting calmly in her lap, posture straight, expression unreadable, as if the storm unfolding around her existed on a different plane entirely, as if the whispers curling through the courtroom air, the subtle glances, the quiet assumptions forming behind eyes that had already decided who she was, simply passed through her without leaving a mark. And maybe that was what unsettled the room the most, not what was being said, but what wasn't, because while Officer Brooks spoke with rising certainty, layering detail upon detail, describing her actions, her tone, her supposed resistance, Ava said nothing, not a single word, not a protest, not a correction, just silence. And in a place where voices defined reality, silence felt almost like surrender. Almost. Because if you looked closely, if you paid attention to the stillness in her gaze, there was something else there, something measured, something patient, the kind of calm that doesn't come from weakness, but from knowing something no one else in the room knows yet. And still, the narrative continued to build, Brooks pacing slightly as he spoke, each step deliberate, each sentence tightening the frame around her, turning uncertainty into assumption, assumption into belief, and belief into something that felt dangerously close to truth. And the people watching, the jurors, the clerks, even the judge, leaned into that rhythm. Because it was easier to follow a confident voice than to question it. Easier to accept a story already shaped than to search for the pieces missing from it. And somewhere in the back row, a quiet shift of weight, a glance exchanged between two individuals who seemed more alert than the rest, but no one noticed, not yet, because all eyes were still on the man in uniform and the woman who refused to interrupt him. And then, just for a second, Brooks paused, turning his gaze directly toward Ava, as if expecting something, a reaction, a crack, a sign that his version of events had landed exactly where he wanted it to. But she didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give him anything. And in that moment, something subtle changed, something almost invisible, like the air tightening before a storm you don't realize is coming. And if you were standing there, watching it unfold, you might have thought this was just another routine case, another ordinary hearing, another moment where power spoke. And others listened. But you would have been wrong, because what no one in that courtroom understood yet, not the judge, not the spectators, and certainly not Officer Daniel Brooks, was that the story being told wasn't just being heard, it was being recorded, measured, and quietly dismantled piece by piece. And the woman sitting in silence wasn't losing control of the narrative. She was waiting for the exact moment to take it back. The silence did not break after he finished speaking. It stretched, lingered, settled into the corners of the courtroom like something alive. And for a brief moment, even Officer Daniel Brooks seemed to notice it. The absence of immediate validation, the lack of nods or murmurs that usually followed his statements. But instead of stepping back, he leaned further in, adjusting his stance, clearing his throat as if to reinforce control over a narrative that had not yet been challenged. Your Honor, everything I have presented is supported by procedure and observation, he said, his tone firm, measured, practiced, and yet beneath that confidence there was a faint edge, something almost imperceptible, like a man speaking a little too carefully, while across from him. Ava Carter finally moved, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention, but just enough to shift the balance of the room, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the folder resting beside her. A small motion, quiet, controlled, and yet it carried weight, because it was the first time she had done anything at all. And if you were watching closely, if you were paying attention the way a few in that room had begun to, you would have noticed the change, not in her expression, which remained composed, but in the atmosphere itself, as if something unseen had just aligned into place. And still she did not speak. Not yet. because timing, in moments like this, was everything. And somewhere near the side of the courtroom a man in a gray suit shifted in his seat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he glanced toward the clerk's desk, then back to Ava, then to Brooks. A silent exchange of awareness that passed unnoticed by most but not by everyone. And the judge, who until now had remained largely disengaged, began to lean forward just slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the bench, as though something in the air had finally reached him too. And Brooks continued, adding detail, reinforcing his earlier claims, building his version of events with increasing urgency, because control, once questioned even silently, demands to be reasserted. And that was when Ava lifted her gaze fully, meeting his eyes for the first time since he began speaking, not with anger, not with fear, but with a calm that felt almost disarming, the kind of calm that does not react because it does not need to. And for a fraction of a second, Brooks hesitated. It was subtle, barely there, a pause between words, a flicker in rhythm, but it was real, and once it existed it could not be undone, because doubt, once introduced, does not disappear. It grows, quietly, steadily, and Ava finally spoke, her voice even, steady, carrying clearly through the room without force. "Officer Brooks, are you certain that is your final statement?" The question itself simple, almost procedural, but the way she asked it, the timing, the precision, turned it into something else entirely, not a challenge. Not yet, but a line drawn, and the courtroom felt it, the shift, the tension tightening just a little more, because this was no longer a one-sided narrative. This was the moment before something changed, and Brooks straightened, nodding once, confident again, or at least appearing to be. "Yes, that is correct," he replied, and Ava held his gaze for 1 second longer than necessary, just long enough for the weight of that answer to settle, before her hand moved to open the folder beside her, slow, deliberate, the soft sound of paper against paper echoing louder than it should have in a room that had suddenly gone completely still. And in that stillness, something unseen began to surface, not loudly, not all at once, but with the quiet certainty of truth that has been waiting patiently for its turn. The sound of the folder opening was soft, almost insignificant, but in that moment it carried more weight than anything that had been said so far, because it marked the shift from words to proof, from assumption to something far less flexible. And Ava Carter did not rush it. She did not flood the room with explanations or raise her voice to claim attention. Instead, she moved with precision, sliding a single document forward onto the table in front of her before lifting her eyes back toward Officer Daniel Brooks, not in confrontation but in clarity, as if what came next was not an argument but a correction that had simply been waiting its turn. And the judge noticed it first, the change in posture, the deliberate calm, his hand pausing mid-motion as he glanced down toward the document now resting within reach of the clerk. And for the first time since the hearing began there was hesitation in the rhythm of the room, not spoken, not acknowledged, but present, growing quietly beneath the surface, and Brooks saw it too, even if he did not fully understand it yet, his shoulders tightening just slightly, his stance adjusting as though preparing to respond to something that had not yet been said, because instinct, even when untrained, recognizes when control begins to slip. And Ava spoke again, her voice steady, clear, each word placed with intention. "Officer Brooks, the statement you just confirmed, it was submitted under oath, correct?" And he nodded, quicker this time. "Yes, that is correct," his tone still firm but carrying a trace of urgency now, a need to maintain the structure he had built. And Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the answer without emotion before continuing. "Then I would like to direct your attention to the timestamp included in your report, specifically the sequence of events you described between 2:14 p.m. and 2:26 p.m. And there it was, the first thread pulled, not dramatic, not explosive, but precise. And precision is what unravels certainty, because when the clerk passed the document forward and the judge began to read, the silence in the room shifted again, no longer passive but focused, and Brooks opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, then tried again, beginning to explain, to clarify, to adjust, but Ava did not interrupt him. She simply waited, allowing his words to fill the space while the evidence quietly settled into place. And if you were sitting there, watching it unfold, you would begin to notice something subtle but undeniable, The difference between someone trying to maintain control and someone who no longer needed to. Because Ava was not reacting to him. She was moving ahead of him, step by step, and when he finished speaking, she responded with the same calm tone, almost gentle, "Thank you." And then she reached into the folder again, retrieving a second document, placing it beside the first, aligning them carefully as if the order itself mattered, which it did, because truth, when presented correctly, does not need force, it builds. And she continued, "This is a verified access log from the courthouse security system. It records all entries and exits within that time frame." And for a brief moment, nothing happened, no gasps, no sudden reactions. Just a quiet pause as the judge's eyes moved between the pages, comparing, calculating. And then his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for those paying attention to feel it ripple outward, because in that small shift, that slight narrowing of his gaze, was the first visible crack in the narrative that had seemed so solid only minutes ago, and Brooks saw it. He had to, because his voice came again, this time faster, overlapping slightly with the silence he had once controlled, attempting to explain discrepancies that had not yet been fully voiced. And Ava watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the same steady composure, because this was not the moment of impact, not yet. This was the moment where the truth began to surface, piece by piece. Undeniable not because it was loud, but because it was exact, and in that courtroom, where words had shaped reality just moments before, something far more powerful was taking its place, something that did not depend on who spoke the loudest, but on what could no longer be ignored. The room did not erupt. It did not need to, because the shift was quieter than that, heavier, like something settling into place that could not be moved again. And as the judge continued scanning the documents, his fingers slowing against the paper, the rhythm of the courtroom changed in a way no one could ignore, not even Officer Daniel Brooks, whose voice now came with a different texture, less controlled, more reactive. "Your Honor, if I may clarify, there could be a delay in the system logs. These systems are not always perfectly synchronized." His words arriving quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed alone could restore the authority he had carried just moments ago. But Ava Carter did not respond immediately. She let the explanation sit in the air, let it stretch, because sometimes the weight of a statement reveals itself best when it is not interrupted. And when she finally spoke, her tone remained even, measured, but there was a subtle shift now, a precision that cut more sharply than volume ever could. "Of course, Officer Brooks, and that is why I anticipated that possibility." And with that, she reached once more into the folder, retrieving a third document, placing it down with the same deliberate care, aligning it beside the others so that the sequence was unmistakable. And if you were watching closely, you could see the pattern forming, not just in the documents, but in the way she presented them, each piece not standing alone but reinforcing the last, building something that did not rely on belief but on structure. And the clerk handed the new document to the judge, who adjusted his glasses slightly, leaning forward now, fully engaged, as Ava continued. "This is the certified synchronization report for the courthouse system, verified within 24 hours of the incident, confirming that all timestamps are accurate within less than 1 second." And that was the moment the explanation lost its footing, not abruptly, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet, undeniable absence of support, because where there had been room for doubt, there was now none, and Brooks felt it, the space closing around him, his posture tightening again, his eyes flickering briefly toward the gallery as if searching for something, anything, that might anchor him back into control. But the room had already shifted. The same audience that had leaned into his confidence earlier now leaned into the silence, watching, waiting, and for the first time since the hearing began, the attention was no longer his to command, and Ava remained still for a moment, allowing that realization to settle, because timing was not just about when to speak, but when not to. And then she took one small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance between herself and the narrative that had been built against her. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that no longer needed to prove itself. "Officer Brooks, given that the system logs are verified and your statement was made under oath, would you like to revise any part of your testimony before we proceed further?" And the question landed differently than the first, Because this time it was not just a line drawn. It was a door offered, a chance to step back before what came next, and the courtroom felt it, the pause stretching longer than before, heavier, charged with the understanding that whatever answer followed would not simply fill the silence, it would define it. And Brooks hesitated, truly hesitated now, his lips parting, closing, his breath catching just slightly as he weighed the options in a space that had suddenly become far less predictable. And in that hesitation, something else became clear, something that had been building quietly since the first document touched the table. The realization that this was never just about correcting a statement. It was about revealing a pattern, and Ava knew it. Every movement, every word, every pause leading to a moment that had not yet arrived, but was already unavoidable. And as she stood there, composed, unshaken, the room began to understand, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the shift from uncertainty to something far more dangerous for the man who had once controlled the narrative. Because truth, when it moves this carefully, does not rush. It arrives exactly when it is ready, and when it does, there is no place left to hide. The hesitation did not go unnoticed. It spread through the courtroom like a quiet signal, subtle but unmistakable. And for the first time since the hearing began, the authority that had once surrounded Officer Daniel Brooks no longer felt solid. It felt conditional, dependent on what he said next, and that realization alone changed everything. Because confidence can carry a narrative, but hesitation exposes it. And as the seconds stretched, longer than anyone expected, longer than anyone was comfortable with, the judge leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firmer now. "Officer Brooks, you may answer the question." And it was not a demand, not yet, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that reminded everyone in the room that this was no longer just a presentation. It was a process, one that required clarity, and Brooks finally spoke, his tone measured but noticeably tighter. "There is no need to revise my statement. Your Honor, everything I reported remains accurate to my understanding of the situation, and the phrasing mattered. It shifted subtly from certainty to interpretation, from fact to perspective. And Ava Carter heard it. Of course she did, because that was what she had been waiting for. Not a denial, but a repositioning, a step back that could be used, and she nodded once, slowly, acknowledging his answer without challenge, as if accepting it at face value. But there was something else beneath that nod, something deliberate, because she did not need to argue with his words. She only needed to place them in the right context. And she turned slightly toward the judge, her posture still composed, her movements still precise. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to introduce one final piece of verified evidence into the record before proceeding further." And the judge gave a small nod. "Go ahead." And that was all she needed, because this was the moment everything had been building toward, not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably. And she reached into the folder one last time, her hand steady, retrieving a small device. Rectangular, unremarkable at first glance. But the way she held it, the care with which she placed it on the table, suggested otherwise, and for the first time, a visible ripple moved through the courtroom. Not panic, not confusion, but awareness, the sense that something significant was about to surface, and Ava's voice remained calm as she spoke. "This is a certified body camera recording assigned to Officer Brooks during the time frame referenced in his report." And the words landed with quiet precision, because they did not accuse, they did not confront, they simply presented, and presentation, when backed by truth, is far more powerful than accusation. And Brooks reacted, not with words at first, but with a shift in posture, a tightening of his jaw, a slight movement of his hand, as if reaching for something that was no longer there, control, certainty, whatever it had been. And Ava continued, her tone unchanged. "The recording has been authenticated and verified by the department's own internal review system, as well as an independent federal audit." And at that, the room stilled completely, because now it was no longer about interpretation, no longer about perspective. It was about something that existed beyond both, something that could be seen, heard, and understood without translation. And the judge looked up, his expression no longer neutral but focused, intent, as if the weight of the moment had fully settled in. And Ava took a small step back, giving space not just physically but symbolically, because this was not her moment to speak. This was the moment for the truth to do what it had been waiting to do. And if you were sitting there, watching, you would feel it, the shift from tension to anticipation, from uncertainty to inevitability. Because whatever happened next would not just influence the outcome, it would redefine everything that had been said before. And as the clerk moved to connect the device, the faint sound of cables and clicks echoing far louder than they should have in the silence, Ava's gaze remained steady, not on the judge, not on the room, but on Brooks, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet certainty, because she had never been reacting to him. Not once. She had been leading him, step by step, into a moment where the truth would no longer need her voice to be heard. The screen flickered to life with a faint glow that immediately drew every eye in the courtroom, not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. And as the footage began to play, the room seemed to hold its breath, the quiet hum of the system now the only sound breaking the silence. And what appeared on that screen was not exaggerated, not edited for effect, but simple, direct, and precise. A sequence of moments captured exactly as they had occurred, and for a few seconds, no one moved, not the judge, not the clerk, not even Officer Daniel Brooks, whose gaze remained fixed on the screen as if willing it to shift, to blur, to somehow align with the version of events he had already committed to under oath. But it did not, because truth, when recorded without intention to persuade, does not bend, it does not adjust, it simply exists. And the footage continued, showing timestamps that matched the logs already presented, aligning with the reports Ava Carter had placed before the court, each second reinforcing the structure she had carefully built. And if you were watching closely, you would notice the difference, the gap between what had been said and what was now being seen. Not dramatic, not explosive, but clear, and clarity, in a space like this, is more powerful than any argument. And as the recording progressed, subtle reactions began to ripple through the room. A shift in posture here, a glance exchanged there, the quiet recognition that something important was unfolding, something that could not be undone once it was fully understood. And Brooks finally moved, his hand rising slightly as if to interject, to explain, but no words came, because interruption requires confidence, and confidence had begun to slip, replaced by something far less stable. Something that comes when the ground beneath a narrative starts to give way. And Ava did not look at the screen, not anymore. She had already seen what it would show. She did not need to watch it again. Instead, her attention remained on Brooks, steady, composed, not accusatory, not triumphant, simply present, as if witnessing not just the footage, but the moment it created. And when the recording reached the point that mattered most, the exact window he had described in his statement, the room grew even quieter, if that was possible, because now the difference was no longer subtle. It was measurable, visible, undeniable, and the judge leaned forward further, his focus fully captured, his earlier neutrality replaced by a careful, deliberate attention that signaled something had changed at a deeper level. And when the footage finally ended, the screen fading back to black, the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, not empty, but filled with understanding, with the weight of what had just been seen. And for a long moment, no one spoke, because there are moments when words are no longer necessary, when the absence of sound says more than any explanation could. And then the judge exhaled slowly, setting the documents down with a measured motion, his voice calm, but no longer distant. "Officer Brooks, do you wish to revise your statement at this time?" And the question was the same as before, but it no longer felt like an option. It felt like a turning point, and Brooks stood there, the space around him no longer supportive but exposing, every second stretching, every eye on him, waiting, not for defense, not for justification, but for acknowledgement. And Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, because this was never about forcing a reaction. It was about allowing the truth to reach a point where it could not be ignored. And in that courtroom, under the steady lights and the watchful silence, the balance had shifted completely, not through confrontation, not through volume, but through something far more powerful, something that had been there from the beginning, waiting quietly for the moment it would finally be seen. The question did not echo, but it lingered, settling into the space between expectation and consequence. And Officer Daniel Brooks stood there with the weight of it pressing against him, not as a demand, but as a reality he could no longer step around. And for the first time since he had entered that courtroom, the certainty that had carried him began to unravel in ways that could not be hidden behind posture or tone. Because the room had changed, the same room that once followed his lead now watched him, not with admiration, not with agreement, but with a quiet, focused attention that asked for something very different, something he had not prepared to give. And if you were standing there, you would feel it, the shift from authority to accountability, subtle but absolute. And Brooks finally spoke, his voice lower now, less measured, carrying a weight it had not carried before. Your Honor, I would like to clarify that my report was based on my understanding at the time, and the phrasing came again, not as strong as before, not as certain, but it was enough to signal what had already begun, because clarification is not correction, but it opens the door to it. And the judge did not interrupt, he did not rush the moment. Instead, he allowed it to unfold, because in that unfolding, the truth does more than emerge. It reveals how it was hidden, and Ava Carter remained still, her expression unchanged, but her presence now carried something different, not just calm, but authority, the kind that does not need to be announced because it is already being recognized. And when she spoke again, her voice remained steady, but there was a clarity to it that cut through the room with precision. Officer Brooks, your understanding has now been presented alongside verified records and authenticated footage. And she paused, not for effect, but for accuracy, allowing the weight of those words to settle fully before continuing. Would you agree that your statement does not align with the documented timeline? And the question was not aggressive. It did not accuse. It simply placed the truth beside the claim and asked for acknowledgement. And that is what made it impossible to avoid, because there are moments when denial requires more effort than acceptance, and this was one of them. And Brooks hesitated again. But this time it was different, not a brief pause, not a flicker, but a full stop, the kind that forces a decision, and the courtroom felt it, every second stretching longer, heavier, until finally he nodded, once, small but visible. Yes, there appears to be a discrepancy, and the word itself was careful, chosen, but it was enough, because acknowledgement, even partial, changes everything, and the room shifted again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but definitively, because now the narrative had moved from defense to recognition, from control to consequence. And Ava did not press further. She did not need to. Instead, she turned slightly toward the judge, her posture composed, her voice even. Your Honor, at this time I would like to formally enter into the record that Officer Brooks has acknowledged a discrepancy between his sworn statement and verified evidence. And the clerk noted it, the sound of pen against paper marking the moment in a way that felt far more permanent than any spoken word. And Brooks stood there, no longer the center of control, but the subject of something far more structured, something that did not rely on his voice to continue. And Ava allowed a brief silence to follow, not out of hesitation, but out of precision, because what came next would not just clarify the situation, it would redefine it entirely. And when she spoke again, her gaze steady, her tone unchanged, there was a shift, subtle but undeniable, as she reached into her folder one final time, not for another document, not for another piece of evidence, but for something else, something that had been present from the beginning, waiting. And as she held it in her hand, she did not raise it immediately. She did not announce it, because some truths do not need introduction, they need timing. And in that moment, as the courtroom held its breath once more, it became clear that everything up to this point had not been the conclusion. It had been the foundation for what was about to be revealed. The room did not move when she lifted her hand, but something inside it shifted, something deeper than attention, something closer to recognition. Because the object she held was not large, not dramatic, just a simple identification wallet, dark, unassuming, the kind of thing that could easily go unnoticed in any other moment. But not here, not now, and Ava Carter did not rush to open it. She let it rest in her hand for a second longer than expected, allowing the weight of anticipation to build. In the silence that had already proven itself capable of carrying more than words ever could. And then, with a controlled motion, she flipped it open, turning it just enough so the judge could see first, because authority, when revealed properly, does not seek the room. It acknowledges the structure already in place. And the judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he focused, reading, processing, and then something changed, not loudly, not with shock, but with a subtle shift that traveled through his posture, his expression sharpening in a way that had not appeared at any point before. And that shift alone was enough to send a quiet ripple through the courtroom, because authority recognized changes the room before it is even explained. And Ava spoke, her voice steady, unraised, but now carrying a clarity that no longer needed to hold back. Your Honor, my name is Ava Carter, federal government inspector assigned to oversight investigations involving internal conduct and procedural integrity within law enforcement agencies. And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not argumentative, not defensive, but declarative, each word placing her exactly where she had always been, even when no one knew it. And for a moment, no one responded, not because they did not hear her, but because understanding takes a second longer when it changes everything. And Brooks stood frozen, not physically restrained, but caught in the realization that the narrative he had tried to control was never his to begin with, because the person he had described, questioned, and attempted to define had been standing in front of him with a level of authority he had not even considered. And Ava continued, not to emphasize herself, but to clarify the situation. My presence in this courtroom today was not incidental. It was part of an ongoing review into procedural discrepancies, including those involving sworn statements and evidentiary conduct. And now the pieces aligned, not just for the judge, not just for the clerk, but for everyone, because what had seemed like a defense had in fact been an observation, what had seemed like silence had in fact been assessment, and what had seemed like a reaction had in fact been preparation. And Brooks shifted again, his composure no longer something he could maintain through posture alone, his voice finally breaking into the space, quieter now, uncertain. I was not aware. And Ava turned her gaze toward him, not with accusation, not with hostility, but with something far more precise, awareness. Officer Brooks was never a requirement for the truth to exist, and the statement landed without force, but it carried something heavier than any raised voice could, because it did not seek to win. It simply stated what was already evident. And the judge straightened fully now, his earlier distance gone, replaced by a focused authority that matched the gravity of what had been revealed. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone measured, acknowledging not just her role, but her presence within the process. And Ava inclined her head slightly, maintaining the same composure she had held from the beginning, because nothing about her had changed, only what the room understood about her. And the courtroom, once guided by assumption, now operated under something entirely different, clarity. And in that clarity, the imbalance that had defined the earlier moments no longer existed, because power had not shifted, it had been revealed. And as the silence settled once more, it was no longer uncertain, it was resolved, because the truth had not entered the room. It had been there all along, waiting for the moment it would finally be seen. The silence that followed did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt settled, like something that had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be forced. And the courtroom, once filled with quiet assumptions and unspoken bias, now sat in a different kind of stillness, one shaped by clarity, by the undeniable alignment of truth and evidence. And the judge, no longer leaning forward in curiosity but sitting upright in full authority, looked from Ava Carter to Officer Daniel Brooks with a gaze that carried weight, not anger, not emotion, but responsibility, the kind that comes when a situation has shifted beyond interpretation into fact. And his voice, when it came, was measured, steady, and final. Officer Brooks, based on the evidence presented and your acknowledgement of the discrepancy in your sworn statement, this matter will be referred for further internal and federal review. And the words did not need emphasis, because they carried consequence on their own. And Brooks stood there, no longer trying to reclaim control, no longer attempting to reshape the narrative, because there was nothing left to shape, only something to face. And Ava remained composed, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, not because the moment lacked significance, but because she had understood it long before anyone else in that room had. And she did not step forward, did not claim attention, because this was never about being seen. It was about making sure the truth was, and if you or sitting there, watching it unfold, you would feel the shift in a way that stayed with you. Not loud, not explosive, but steady, like a realization settling in deeper than reaction. Because what had happened in that courtroom was not just a correction of one statement. It was the exposure of something larger, something that had existed quietly beneath the surface until it was brought into the light with precision and patience. And as the clerk began organizing the documents, the sound of paper moving against wood marking the end of a process that had started long before this hearing ever began. Ava closed her folder with the same calm motion she had opened it. No rush, no hesitation, just completion, and she glanced once more at Brooks, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with something far more lasting, a reflection of the moment itself, because the lesson had never been about her proving anything. It had been about him realizing something. And as she turned slightly, preparing to step away from the center of the room, her voice came one final time, quiet but clear, not directed at anyone in particular, but heard by everyone. The truth does not need to be defended when it is already documented. And the words lingered, not as a warning, not as a statement of power, but as something simpler, something undeniable. And in that courtroom, under the steady lights and the weight of what had just been revealed, one thing became clear in a way that could not be undone, he thought. He was shaping the truth, but the truth had been shaping the outcome all along.